What if we approached urban crime as a design problem and deployed our methods and skills to reframe the questions we have been asking to ameliorate, if not completely obliterate, criminal activities? The team at Designing Out Crime Research Centre, a collaboration between the New South Wales Department of Community and Justice and the University of Technology, Sydney, did just that. They used research, public engagement, and human-centered design to tackle a wide range of urban challenges. From fabricating a bin to detect bomb threats to adding more food trucks for reducing alcohol-related crimes in downtown Sydney, Designing Out Crime focused on the process of design rather than the final output of design. Today, we have with us Dr. Lindsay Asquith, who was the director of the Research Centre, to talk about human behaviour and how one could use design to come up with novel solutions for social issues. I am Vaishnavi Shukla, and this is Architecture Off Centre, a podcast where we highlight unconventional design perspectives, practices, and research projects that reflect emerging discourses within the design discipline and beyond. Architecture Off Centre features conversations with radical designers, thinkers, and change makers who are redefining the way we live and interact with the built environment.
Why don't we start off with you telling us a little bit about Designing Out Crime, its early days, and what led you to it?
Yeah, sure. So Designing Out Crime came into being really because we, at the University of Technology, Sydney, decided to answer a tender request that had gone out from the New South Wales Department of Justice. They were looking at innovative ways to tackle crime in New South Wales. And at the time, in the School of Design, Case Dorst had begun to look at how design methodologies could be used to tackle some of crime's most complex, intractable problems. So we answered the call. We did a sort of non-conforming tender, which meant we wrote our own, and we won the bid, and therefore the first of funding was for the first 3 years. We were paid an amount by the New South Wales Department of Justice to look into some crime problems that they identified as being what they call Premier's priorities. So that's how it started, and it was started with only about 3 people, and then we grew to around 12, made up of architects, industrial designers, criminologists, psychologists, historians, visual designers. So the way that we approached crime problems was from all these different disciplines. So using all the methodologies that individual designers and those from other disciplines use to approach problems. So it was never just a one way of looking at crime. So it wasn't looking at crime through a crime lens. Sometimes we looked at it through often it was the design lens, but also a sort of psychology lens and anthropology lens. And always it was about putting people at the center of it. So it was all about human-centered design. So looking at all the stakeholders involved in problems, in all the crime problems. So not just the police or victims, but everyone who is affected by a certain problem. So that's how it came about, and we developed a lot of design tools based on a method called frame creation, which was where we reframed problems. So we looked at a problem. Generally, a client or the government would come to us thinking that, they had defined the problem. But what we would do is spend about 90% of the time understanding the problem and sort of only 10% looking at solutions. So it was really about understanding what lay beneath the problem. Most crime problems, they haven't really changed over time. We still are dealing with a lot of the same crime issues, but through time, we've been using the same solutions. So maybe more and more CCTV, maybe more policing. And so by actually really going beneath what was on the surface and looking at underlying, usually social issues, and seeing where we could use design to intervene to change behaviour, really. That was the fundamental thing. So it was really spending a lot of time thinking about people, thinking about what was important to them, how they behaved, what made them do what they did in certain situations, and then using design to come up with novel solutions.
So if you had to talk about, say, your first project that you worked on once you got the tender, what was the first project like? And I think after that, we can go on to the other very interesting projects that you all did.
Yeah, so the first project was really, a lot of the projects we did to begin with were actually products. So one of the first one was we designed a bin for railway stations. So, and it was to stop the threat of bombs, terrorism, really. So we designed with rail core at the time, a bin, and this was a student project actually, where we designed a bin that which was see-through, and it had a very small aperture at the top. So it wasn't so much about the bomb itself, if there was a terrorist threat. It was more that there were terrorist threats that meant that there was so much disruption. Whereas with this bin, you could see immediately what was in it, and therefore, counterterrorism police could deal with it more effectively. That was one of the first products we designed, and then we went on to design things for Woolies and just shelving to mitigate the risk of shoplifting. So at that time, the sort of things that were stolen were mostly things like high-end things that cost more money, like actually baby formula, makeup, razor blades, that sort of thing. So we designed shelving that actually not only it lit up as people approached it, and it also had descriptions of products. So instead of making the whole experience one of more sort of like more CCTV or more security staff patrolling, it was actually trying to enhance customer satisfaction as well. So the shelving was nice, it was good, but it meant you were lingering longer, which meant there was more likely to be people in the aisles and therefore less, so more eyes on the street, we call it. So it was looking at different ways of creating less opportunity for shoplifting and at the same time making the experience better for all customers. Because if you design something for the 10% who are going to behave badly, you actually take away from the rest of the population, the 90% who are actually trying to enjoy a shopping experience.
So almost like creating a communal accountability of sorts while you're out shopping, so that if the one person who is trying to get something, there are the other 5 who are there making sure it doesn't happen, or just creating that accountability that you're under view or scrutiny, local surveillance almost.
Yes,
yeah.
Exactly. So when lighting comes up, it's going to detract you from trying to, because you're more highlighted at the time that you might decide to put something in your bag. So that was something that we trialed. So those were the first kind of projects, and then we sort of, crime prevention has changed over the years, and we started to get into social and systems design. So it wasn't just products; it was actually how can you intervene in systems, it wasn't just about making cities safer. There was all sorts of different things where we felt that we could make a difference. So one of the biggest projects we did was with the City of Sydney Council, where we looked at King's Cross. And at that time, it was around 2012, 2013, King's Cross was, always in the news. There was alcohol-related violence. A lot of the clubs and bars had problems with violence. So they asked us to look at what we could do to help with that. What were the underlying causes of this? So we ran a lot of stakeholder workshops. We did some student design studios as well. We did a lot of surveillance. We went out and about at night on the street to actually observe what was going on. And what we discovered was that 80 to 90% of the people going out in King's Cross, they're 18-year-olds going out for a good night. They're not going to cause trouble. It's a rite of passage. King's Cross has always been a rite of passage. It's a bit edgy, it's a bit grungy, and it was something that everybody, wanted to do, go out in King's Cross. What we found was that it wasn't so much King's Cross itself, it was all the services around it that were not working to make that night a good one. There wasn't enough transport in and out of King's Cross, which is quite a densely populated area, and there's a lot of bars in a very small area, so you've got a lot of congestion on the streets outside clubs and nightclubs. You don't have enough toilets, things like that. There was only big clubs. There was nothing else. There was no other distractions. Nothing else was open. It was basically just alcohol. So we looked at all these things and we thought, well, how can we reframe it? What the City of Sydney wanted was, how can you could create a vibrant but safe night time? So we used our design methodology, which I sort of mentioned, which is frame creation, to reframe the problem. So we looked at how could we view King's Cross in a different way, and what new frame could we use to look at it. So all the stakeholders got together and we came up with, if we imagine that King's Cross was organised like an event, like a music festival, how could you make it work better? So you then immediately start to think about all the services that are required to make a music festival successful. And they're all to do with the transport, food options, toilets, different attractions apart from the main attractions. At music festivals you might have a main event or a main star, but around it there's a lot of other things going on which dissipates crowds so that you don't get lots of crowds at one space all of the time. So we looked at the whole thing through this lens, and what it meant was the City of Sydney were able to sort of start to think of it in a different way. Like if you didn't look at through the lens of alcohol-related violence, but as if it was a music festival, you would immediately start to bring some positive things in. You would start to positively redefine the nighttime. And they began by doing a whole new nighttime strategy, which was called Open Sydney. So it's instead of thinking about it as a closed thing, that they wanted to shut down things, how can you make it open and more attractive to lots of different demographics? What they wanted was to just not have the 18-year-olds out, but actually attract more women, more families. So they looked, it wasn't just King's Cross that they started to make changes. Their whole nighttime strategy involved things like creating more opportunities for small bars to thrive. So instead of there just being large venues, small bars they've got 100 patrons at maximum, and they have a different license, and also they attract older people. They attract that 40 plus. Generally, they're quieter and that sort of after work vibe. And then also they started trialed a food truck program so that there could be more options for food to soak up alcohol at night. So people could, and food trucks, generally you don't want to go out for dinner if you're drinking, but you do need something to eat. So more options with food trucks around certain areas of the city where people could get food, for 24 hours when the clubs were open. So those were, and then they trialled putting in temporary toilets every Friday and Saturday night in the city and in King's Cross, just increasing the availability of that thing, and also nighttime buses, so to bus people out to where they could get their trains home, because a lot of people come from all over. They're coming from the north, the south, not just from the city, and it was hard to get home. And that's where a lot of the kind of violence was happening, not in the clubs themselves, but actually in the streets around, in the taxi queues. They trialled secure taxi ranks where you had more security guards monitoring and the queues and all that. And this, in 2012, there was no Uber, so taxi ranks were the thing to get in and out.
There's two questions. I'm wondering which one I should ask first, but okay. Let's go with the flow and maybe just talk a little bit about the relationship between design and crime. So the cases that you mentioned, the products or the solutions kind of reach from the design of a physical product to almost like a strategy or even a policy of sorts, where you're talking about looking at an entire area and then involving different stakeholders, whether they are power owners or whether they are the people from the transportation department, and looking at a problem from kind of a zoomed out lens rather than a zoomed in lens. I'm wondering if we were to think about inserting design in, I wouldn't say the process of crime, but just thinking about whether design comes at a stage of prevention or it comes at a stage of retrospective cure. I don't know if it makes any sense. What do you think about how design interacts with a particular crime? I mean, most times that surveillance comes in, and in the intro season trailer, I was just talking about how I've been reading a lot about Shoshana Zuboff and Michel Foucault, and they all talk about surveillance in very different ways. Either surveillance as a way of creating discipline, which is, I guess, what we're trying to do when you're talking about redesigning the shelves is, when you design shelves in a certain way, it disciplines the person who is probably aiming to shoplift to behave in a certain way, which is to not shoplift. But in other ways, I think where design comes is to kind of look at something that has already happened, retrospectively analyze it, and then enter into this cyclical movement where you try to shift it from the place of a cure to place of prevention. So with your experience in designing out crime, did you ever think about where you positioned yourselves in this process, whether it was always aimed towards prevention? I guess that's the ideal goal, but whether it was at any point a retrospective act?
I think it really, that's what does happen, is that often we wanted to be involved much earlier on in the process, so that you can have an influence before, so you can be more proactive than reactive in what you're designing. So, it would be wonderful if cities were designed with the safety of women, paramount, at the beginning, rather than having to look at areas where crimes against women or whatever you're looking at have occurred, and then redesign and maybe remodeling something then. But actually to have, crime prevention through environmental design was a big thing when we were doing this, but we saw that as only going so far. Whereas with designing out crime, the whole thing about it was to really understand people and how people react in space or react to things. So really trying to get to the bottom of human-centered design and human values, and actually being very positive about, designers are positive. We are always trying to make things better. Yeah, we're always trying to increase the experience of the user, and therefore, when we were approached often by clients, sometimes it was at the stage where something had already been designed, like a park or something. Then they realized there was issues. So there's a few times when we were able to be proactive. When Barangaroo, which is a big area in Sydney that was being designed, we actually were approached at the design stage, so that we could look at things like the lighting, but also how tall the trees should be, that sort of thing. So, how that natural would that and whether, and we did a whole series of looking at parks throughout Sydney to get an idea of, and looking at the crime statistics, which parks were safer than others and why that might be. And was it to do with lighting? Was it to do with the fact where they were? Was it, with their location with respect to the things that were around it? Was it to do with the fact that they shut at a certain time or that they were constantly open? So it was really, when we were involved early on, I would say that that's when we would prefer to be involved, so that we could have I think design should always be right at the beginning of anything, really. It is, it's important to really make that difference as early on as you can, so that you're being proactive rather than having to react to something that that has happened, and therefore designing on the sort of back foot, really. And we brought you, so there's a book that we brought out from Designing Out Crime called Designing for the Common Good, and that's got a whole range of the projects that we've worked on over the years, and really it's that common good that was important. It's not designing just for one group, but being very inclusive in the design, so that all groups who use space or are impacted by something have a say in the solution, which is why so much of the work we did was stakeholder engagement, workshops, really getting to the bottom of what the problem was, not just for one group of people, but for all groups using that, who might be part of the solution now or could be part of the solution in the future.
And maybe would you say that it also involves rethinking the definition of design? Because when we think about design, we by default think of it as a solution to something. But the way you're describing it, it almost seems like it, of course, in your team involved people from different backgrounds, and design not always took the form of producing something, but also kind of aiming at problems more structurally, so that you address maybe the root cause, if that's ever possible to do when you're talking about crime, but still look at it as a tool rather than a product. In that sense, I've always wondered, because either legally or even in terms of policy making, every time there's something that happens and there's an effort to prevent it from happening again, there's, in terms of what is produced, is always a manual of sorts or a law of sorts or a guideline of sorts. And because you're working with such different projects and such different scales, I've always been curious to really think about the role of a manual, and whether, all the observations put together in the form of a manual with certain recommendations or certain things to do and things to not do. What was your experience with, just making guidelines? Because if we were to make something more accessible to the public, I think it has to be in the form of something that is more, I don't want to say prescribed, but kind of that, this is the best way to do this, or comes in form of recommendations. What are your thoughts on manuals and just guides?
I think they do have their place. I mean, we did a project for legal aid where we did a whole series of guidelines, and some of our projects do, the client comes to us and they do want guidelines and they do want recommendations, to go forward. I think the thing that you have to be aware of is not being too prescriptive about things, because things change, environments change. If we brought out a manual for King's Cross, within 2 years there were lockdown laws. It was a very different situation. Things happen and you have to be able to adapt. And I think really it's about what we've always felt is about the methods you use to look at things. So, the methods that we use can be adapted to any situation, really, because they are about understanding deeply whatever problem we look at and reframing it. So that problem might shift, like King's Cross's problem was not alcohol-related violence after 3 or 4 years, so much as it became all about the lockdown laws and lockouts, and King's Cross became this place where there was nobody, which was equally as sad and had its own problems, yes? So and that was because of various government interventions. So sometimes the problem shifts, but our methodology is designed so that it really is designed to get to the heart of the problem, whatever it is, and you can adapt it to different contexts. I think governments often, they do want us to come, if we can help with strategy and all of those things, but guidelines, sometimes if you do I've always found that they become standards. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So you're always designing for a standard, and therefore not optimizing the possibility of designing for the best you can do. And that's what I think we always strive to as designers, to design the best environment, given all the different circumstances that you're having to look at.
I think the reason why I was really drawn to your work was, one, because the way you approached any problem, any case was through multiple different lenses. Usually what happens is if, for example, if it's a question of, women's safety in a city, you would, unless it reaches a level that is really worrisome, first, there's no action. Well, at least speaking from my experience in India. And if there's something that does happen that, pushes people to think about women's safety, you would ideally have the government creating a panel of sorts, like a committee, to look into the problem and then come up with the best ways in which it could be avoided or postponed, if not avoided. And the way you approached it was fascinating, because you're not really talking about it in the form of a committee, which usually is homogeneous, but you had a team which was more heterogeneous and which came from all different backgrounds and different perspectives. And that's why the recommendation or the output was very varied and very different. And it's kind of also a little sad to know that designing out crime doesn't exist in its original form anymore. I wouldn't say it's doesn't exist at all, but I would love to know what's in the pipeline for you, and maybe DOC version 2.0, if you've thought about it.
I would love to, yes. I mean, I think like all university sectors during the pandemic, research unfortunately has had to take a back seat, and therefore funding's not always there. So, crime problems haven't gone away. And
they never will, right? I think the nature will always evolve, but it's such an integral part of society. It's just human behavior in one way or another.
I think that, to be honest, there were 10, 12 people all working together in a multidisciplinary team for, 10 years. And although those people are no longer all working together in one place, they are now in other organizations and are, I suppose, transmitting their knowledge. And so actually, even if designing out crime as a physical center doesn't exist anymore, the people that have worked on all these problems are still there and can shape things as we move forward. I still think that all my colleagues over the years will be making a difference as designers in various different arenas, and it might be crime. I mean, we were moving away from crime prevention more into other, social, the more social issues. And actually, we're now there's a few of us are still embedded in the School of Design, and we are looking at social transitions, transition design, how, all the knowledge that we've got from the way we've tried to change how design, how crime is approached, can be used in other, contexts like climate change, health, mental health. And so that's where we're moving. So the methodologies stay quite consistent. The context might change, but crime, is always going to be there. But it's recently we've been dealing more with domestic violence, which is a very different. Using the design methodology on domestic violence is a very tricky thing, but it takes a great patience and understanding of all the people involved, and really looking at the victims, perpetrators, society itself, and working out, what can we do as designers to look at this problem. And I think we will always, those of us who cut our teeth in designing out crime, will always be looking at complex social issues in whatever we're doing going forward, and using our I suppose our knowledge of what we've done before, but also the design tools and methods adapt along the way. You create new ones. So yeah, I feel quite optimistic about the future. Even though we're not all together, I still feel very optimistic that somewhere we're all making a difference, and designing things, as we've always said, for the common good.
Well, as you said, that is a very optimistic note to end this on. I will be on the lookout, Lindsay, to see, what happens next. Maybe not designing out crime, but maybe it'll spiral into something more innovative and more fascinating, and maybe addressing a different set of problems. So I do want to thank you for your time and for this interview. This was actually very insightful. Thank you so much.
Special thanks to Ayushi Thakur for the research and design support, and Kahan Shah for the background score. You can send in guest suggestions to our Instagram account arcofcenter or through our website arcofcenter.com. That is ARCHOFFCENTRE. Thanks for listening.